was just thinking I could use a good shot of strong coffee, but one of the summer schools we were at, I was just telling some friends, was in the South Island of New Zealand, and they had a very enterprising gentleman who came with his Nespresso machine and with his creamer thing, and everybody who bought a coffee from him, all the money went to the fund, and I can tell you they made a lot of money that weekend. So I wanted to take a few minutes to review where we're at in our program of the week and how it all links up together, the period of special potency, the lifetime of Baha'u'llah. You remember, of course, in the letter of 29 December 2015 from the Universal House of Justice, that it was at that time we were introduced to this idea of a period of special potency. And there was a letter that was 16 pages long that was addressed to the Conference of the Counselors at that point. And the last section was about this period of special potency. And when you got to the end there, you read about the importance of worship, the importance of the devotional life, the importance of devotional meetings, the importance of spiritually heightened conversations, the spirit of the Mashal Ashkar, and the enhancement of the devotional character of our communities and holy days. There was a terrific emphasis on the spiritual side of our lives in every different aspect. And then it went on to explain that during the 5-year plan that was about to begin, we would have this special period where we would have highly significant events occurring in 2016, 2017, 2019, and 2021. So these are the 5 years through which we are now making our way. And during our time together here at the summer school, as we approach the first of these 2 bicentenaries, I think we've been trying to gain additional perspective and understanding about the peerless personage of Baha'u'llah and his revelation in order to better express and share his story with others. Not necessarily in sort of, I don't know what to call it, Baha'is or Baha'i terms and language all the time, but in terms and concepts that many can grasp and understand. So on Sunday we discussed the personage of Baha'u'llah and the nature of his revelation. We were reviewing what we had actually learned about how a manifestation of God reveals his religion, and gaining some perspective about the revelation of the Blessed Beauty in comparison to former manifestations. Stories were also shared about some of the holy places, and we considered how fortunate we are to have them and to be able to visit them and better visualize parts of his life. On Monday, we moved on to the subject of the proclamation to the world's secular and religious leaders of this time. To whom did he write? What did he write? How did they, for the most part, react? And of course, you have a very fine course going on, 8 sessions specifically on this subject. And we also studied how, in the words of both the Bab and Baha'u'llah, the faith is destined to eventually be spread, but the privilege being given to the meek and the lowly, rather than to perhaps the more rich and powerful of this day. So yesterday, we proceeded. We really studied the actual spread of the faith in the first 150 years, 1844 through 1996. We had charts and stories. We saw that this was not a linear procedure. It had its ups and its downs. And I thought it was quite interesting the way we looked at the sort of revelation and repression in the time of Bab and Baha'u'llah, and the sort of breakout in the time of Abdu'l-Baha, and then reaching the far corners of the earth in the time of the beloved guardian. And then, as my husband had put it, putting flesh on the bones in the time of the custodians and the House of Justice. I have always felt that this question of setbacks, when the major plan and the minor plan of God kind of collide And certain areas of the world which we had thought were advancing very quickly are unable to continue doing so. This is all in God's plan somehow. As we say in French, l'homme propose, mais Dieu dispose. This means that man proposes things, but God decides all of this. So up to us to do our very best and roll along with this extraordinary combination of what's going on with the major plan and the minor plan. Another example that I kept running into in some of my work was in Liberia. Liberia was moving fast at a certain point. They had the best radio program in the whole world. They were the most advanced in their system of reporting from all over the country back to the capital city, and how many people, because there weren't that many radio stations at the time in Monrovia. And then came a 10-year civil war that just completely changed the situation there. So it's mysterious, I think, for all of us. Today, we're moving on to look at how now we can see large numbers of people from various populations gradually moving towards Baha'u'llah in this, our 21st century. And the real purpose of the time that I'm going to be talking is to try and better understand how this came about and how it's working its way out. How is our faith now penetrating the soil of society, not in just a few areas of the world, but in a number of countries? How is it that we, a few million people of such diverse backgrounds, have learned how to coordinate worldwide educational processes, promote the development of human resources, as well as to start a process of community building in widely varying cultural settings? We're moving all the time into new stages. It's like when we were talking the other day, some of the young parents who have children, very young children in their marriages, you know, these themes are shifting in our lives all the time. You have to keep consulting constantly every 6 months to stay on top of what is the situation with the marriage and with the children and with the professions, and is service still at the center of our lives. But on a larger scale, this is what we can view if we take a step back and look at the big picture of the development of the faith in the world. Sometimes I feel we stand too close. It's really very difficult to see. Maybe we see the trees instead of the forest. So maybe if we just review together in perspective ever so briefly some of these steps that we have gone through recently, and we'll have a better understanding of the quite amazing path the Universal House of Justice has opened before us in these most recent decades. So please excuse me, this is my own simplified rendering of how this happened. It almost unfolds like a story. If one is responsible to move an entire population of the world, all of the peoples of the world, you need a plan. And luckily, we have the divine plan. And that was one of the things that we were commemorating and celebrating during this 5 years. So we watched the spread of the faith according to that plan in great detail through the 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. As my husband was explaining yesterday, gradually opening all the countries of the world, establishing national and local assemblies, raising up an entire administrative process as we went. 9-year, 5-year, 7-year, 6-year, 3-year plans, all one after another, witnessed its unfoldment as the faith spread around the world. Naturally, there were challenges, big ones. This is not a simple process in which we're engaged. The beloved guardian had always advised that expansion and consolidation needed to go hand in hand. But this was not easy. The concept was elusive. In some countries, thousands, more than thousands, came in, but they also slipped out. We had no real system for educating thousands upon thousands of believers or training them to develop their own skills and capacities in order to serve their communities. It gradually became clear that our pattern of growth lacked in sustainability. So as we were in the Central African Republic and Cameroon and these kind of, during this very period, I just sort of try and explain some of our terrific struggles. We were just giving our all, but very difficult to even tread water. When we first went there, there were 3 local spiritual assemblies and 150 believers. This was in 1972. They had just had their first National Spiritual Assembly elected the year before we arrived there. My husband was immediately elected onto that National Spiritual Assembly, and he would go around in our little Renault car, and try and pick up the National Spiritual Assembly members to take them to the meeting. Now, this is just to give you an example of the reality of what was going on. He'd get to somebody's house and he'd sort of see them run around the back of the house. I mean, the friends they didn't have much understanding of what we were all about trying to serve on the National Spiritual Assembly. People didn't have calendars, people didn't have watches. The idea of sitting in the National Baha'i Center for 10, 12, 14, 20 hours over a weekend was something very difficult to understand. The House of Justice was guiding us so carefully and had given us such a detailed plan as what we should do during that particular time. But it was not, an easy process to get moving into this kind of a motion. Really, when we left about 11 years later, we were up to 50 or 60 local spiritual assemblies all across this country that only had about 150 kilometers of paved road and 10 or 15,000 believers. So you get the idea of the receptivity. But how to bring along the consolidation with the expansion. So we were up to, I think, about 100 declarations a month or so, but my goodness, what difficulties. I can remember working so hard on trying to do children's classes. And we'd try to just train a few teachers, bringing them in on these long voyages into the capital city to try and train them, and then giving them stamped envelopes they could carry home and send back a little report about what they were doing. But frankly, it was like pulling teeth. We had no real texts for those children's classes. We had no very efficient way of training the teachers. And there was usually only about 1 children's class for each local assembly if we could manage it. So the difficulties for the Friends were also pretty steep. We had nothing for the junior youth. We would lose, I think all over the world, we lost for a whole period of time those 11 to 14-year-olds because we just didn't have those materials. Devotional meetings, we could have 1 at the Baha'i Center, but the Friends would have to walk 3, 4, 5, 6 kilometers just to get there. Deepenings, we did the best we could, but we didn't have that many people who were capable of giving them. And then books, imagine the challenge of getting just books in French. They all had to come from Belgium. Now you can imagine the price of the books when they came from Belgium down to Bangui or any of the other. Half of Africa is French speaking. So half of the books for the whole continent had to come from Belgium. These were difficult times. Had to be worked into the budget. If they came by airplane, they were phenomenally expensive. We couldn't afford them. You try and buy the Dawnbreakers or any of those other books, it was extremely difficult. And even if they came by boat, because it was cheaper, I can remember them arriving waterlogged, after all the difficulties we'd gone to. So it's not to complain, it's just to give us an idea of what our history was in a number of these different places as we tried to spread the faith. So additional steps, something else was needed to have a more sustainable pattern of growth and begin moving these populations in a more significant way. Of course, the Universal House of Justice was studying this extremely carefully. They had reports from all the national assemblies of the world and through the teaching center for all the counselors of the world, and they began, of course, studying. They were all the time trying to keep the finger on the pulse. In 1996, if you remember, the 4-year plan was launched, and there was a gift that was embedded in that plan. Now, most of us did not perceive of it as a gift, and I think we didn't really understand it at all. But it was the Training Institute. The purpose of that Training Institute was the development of human resources, if you recall. It took quite a while for all around the world for all of us to begin to understand how this was supposed to function. These were courses in the format of study circles that were supposed to give us not only knowledge, spiritual insights, but also develop skills. And you're very familiar now with how, if you go through book 1, this might happen, hopefully, in 2 and 3 and 4. So suddenly, this began to change the face of things terrifically. People actually could have a book of their own with quotes, and the capacity for memorization was simply extraordinary. The younger people, who never had really been permitted to open their mouths in the presence of the older people, were the ones who could read. So they began absolutely memorizing these books and these quotations. They began to be among the most knowledgeable of the people in the country. And gradually, the voice of the youth would, of course, come into local spiritual assemblies and into the National Convention and all of that. So the generation gap that had been really wicked began to diminish so that everybody could begin to serve the faith better. So the skills help them to become children's classes, devotional meetings, better teach the faith. You know how it all goes. So actually, all around the world, it might not have been very evident, but we began building slowly, gradually, surely, an international, decentralized, self-perpetuating educational system. One that would little by little help us to achieve this more sustainable pattern of growth. So this process of transformation of our characters through a close study of the writings was indispensable before proceeding onto a more significant community building process. Certain things were needed as prerequisites, and these were made available through this Training Institute process. As I said, the transformation of character, principles, standards, virtues, the skill of consultation had to be learned, the need to reduce, as I said the other day, and efface as much as possible backbiting because of all the conflict between the tribal unities and all these kinds of things. How to encourage one another and learn to bring out one another's capacities rather than put down people all the time who came up. These are very such basic things, but when you think about building up a society, we need the spiritual qualities. Those are our key. We're not going to do it without those. There was one story I had of this sort of trying to empower somebody else. When we moved to Cameroon, I made a friend. Her name was Christine. Christine was very capable. She was a secretary in somebody's office, and so I'd say, now, Christine, let's go together to the village. I'll drive the car, but you talk. Oh, no, Madame Lincoln, je ne peux pas. She was so shy. No, she just couldn't possibly talk. But little by little, she began to talk. Then we would say, now, Christine, we're going to go to a meeting at the center in Douala here, and I think it'd be great if you could talk on this topic. Oh, Madame Lincoln, je ne peux pas. But of course, she did. She began to do this. And then we moved away to another country. We went to the Ivory Coast, and then we went to the Holy Land. When we got to the Holy Land, I'm reading the reports from the counselors. Cameroon, the counselor has a new board member, and her name is Christine. Christine now has 35 assistants up and down the coast of Cameroon, and she is out there doing her work, encouraging them to open their mouth and start sharing all of these gifts. Thus, I'm sure that you've had these same experiences here in the UK. It's the way our faith grows. It's the way we develop our capacity. But in a country where people were so submissive in many cases and not used, they wanted the clergy to do everything or the government to do everything, it was really kind of a from the bottom up operation. So we began also gaining a better understanding of the relationship between work and worship and all of these things with which you're familiar. There was also something that happened to us that in the Central African Republic that I didn't get it at first. It was really years afterwards I began to get it. When we were there, there were people who would sort of ask me, well, so what are you doing with that little organization of yours? You know, this kind of thing. There's about 150, 200 Baha'is floating around, and so a total misunderstanding. Are you building a church? No, we weren't. Are you building a school? No, we're not. Do you have a clinic or a hospital somewhere? No. What are you doing? And so I would say the best I could say was we're just at the beginning of raising up our community and organizing our administration because we don't have any clergy. So they would sort of watch and wonder. And then I had close friends. This is the lesson I learned. Close friends who were in AID. Are you familiar with AID? American Development Organization, and CIDA, that was the Canadian one. And they had different projects around the country. This is a very simple example, but I think it's profound. One of them had was doing fish ponds, teaching people the skill of building fish ponds, because they thought that was the way to help them economically. Well, I talked to them after a little while. They said, well, actually, we've stopped the fish pond project. And I said, oh, what happened? That sounded like a great idea to build fish pond. They said, well, what kept happening was when we came to drain the fish ponds, there were no more fish. So what had happened? The people didn't have confidence in the project. They didn't have confidence in the people who were running the project. They weren't sure they were going to get their fish at the end. So they would sort of sneak in and pull out their fish at night. So they wanted to get something out of the project. So what does that say to us about trustworthiness, for example? About honesty, about working together, about if you were so lucky to have a skill such as consultation and involve all the people of the village truly from the bottom up. Well, I thought that was interesting. And then I heard another group of people, they'd had a project up in the north of the country to repair trucks and cars, indispensable with the roads, you know. But what they also, their project sort of fell apart. I talked to that person when he came down to Bangui to find out. He said, no, you know, Johnny, what happened was little by little, the tools started disappearing from the garage. And so where we were working and trying to teach people, it just, it was not sustainable the way we had been doing it. This was way back in the 70s. You know, when development projects, I mean, people have learned so much now about getting the local people involved. But for me at the time, it was quite revealing because we were just kept plodding along in our own way at that particular stage of building the New World Order, which was local assemblies and a few little children's classes and consultation and these kinds of things. But I saw that in the long run, if you don't do it the other way around, transform the character first, teach certain skills first, it's harder to actually achieve activities that are leading to sort of more community building types of things. So once the establishment of our educational process was underway, we were committed to the transformation of the characters, our character, I mean. Additional concepts were gradually introduced to us. Now, you, of course, will remember all of this. The cluster came along, right? Had anybody heard of cluster? No. We hadn't. There's a cereal over in the United States that's called clusters or something, maybe here too. But the movement of clusters, the core activities, the programs of growth, the intensive programs of growth, the need to have an outward-looking orientation. Did that mean we were a little bit inward-looking? I mean, we can look back on these things now with more perspective, but at the time, they were very challenging. None of them were familiar to us, and we had to work on them all over the world. There was a lot of change. But we know from the history of our faith, it has undergone terrific change all the way along. And many more difficult situations, for example, with the passing, at the time of the passing of Baha'u'llah, the passing of Abdu'l-Baha, the passing of the beloved guardian, after the election of the Universal House of Justice. Just think and remind ourselves of the struggles and the changes that went on at that time. So we're in a different age now, and we have different kinds of challenges. I think one can say when the tree shakes a little bit, sometimes the leaves fall off. But the House of Justice knows exactly what it is doing. It knows what the Baha'i world needs at all times. So the more we can cling to what the House of Justice tells us to do, the better off we're going to be. So the bottom line is to hang on to the hem of the robe and keep going. Even if we don't quite get the point at the time, it is going to become clear. So we learned so many things from the House of Justice about community building process, which was then sort of the more recent kind of language that's coming in, about how, because we are fundamentally spiritual in nature, this educational process is indispensable. That I like to think it's lifelong now, from the pregnancy prayer all the way through, and then children's prayers, and then children's classes and junior youth classes, and then the study circles, until we move on into the next world. But we now have an entire lifetime of learning and spiritual wisdom that will be coming to us if we manage to maintain our own commitment to this process. The close link between worship and service that's indispensable for us to have in the way we build communities, because they're of a spiritual nature. And as I said before, the outward looking orientation. So additional skills, we suddenly began to learn about some of these messages from the House of Justice, then began to talk about things like systematic action and analysis and strategic planning and management, overcoming setbacks so we don't always go yan, whose fault was that, and all the rest of it. And we learn how to keep moving through this consultation and action and reflection and keep evolving. We try to keep improving our self-expression to learn how to speak to one another and accompany one another. Now, I know that some of these messages, and some of them have been long, 15, 16, 17-page messages, and they're not so easy to understand. But if one does take the step back and one thinks about where our Baha'i world is at right now, you begin to see that these kinds of guidance are indispensable. For example, consider the following. The Friends in Lubumbashi, Democratic Republic of Congo, now have in their cluster about 4,000 Baha'is and an additional 9,000 in their community of interest. Now, how are they going to organize themselves if they don't have these skills such as those mentioned above? They literally need to be experts in management just to keep that city and all of its activities functioning. They need a wide range of skills to keep going. Actually, I got because I'm still in a lot of contact with these friends there. Most recent statistics, just to give you an idea of what they're dealing with, one of the counselors sent them to me. How many junior youth groups do they have in that one cluster? 206, with a total of 2,808 junior youth. How many children's classes are they trying to keep afloat? 271, with 5,432 children. 207 study circles with 1,004 people, 525 devotional meetings with 3,796. They're very precise. So that's why they come out with this 13,140. So when we think about the challenge before those cluster agencies, they have 12 strong local assemblies in that one area, and they have already started up 8 community schools in the region. But we begin to see, when the numbers start pouring in, what kind of skills and organization is needed. So I've asked before, how could a community of 5 to 6 million people from almost every culture and background set up a fledgling but global educational system? Add on courses each year, translate those materials into how many languages? Print them, publish them, distribute them, orient and train the tutors, and on and on. And you know about the junior youth program and now the ISGP, right? And we have others in Africa that we don't have in Europe, a PAS program for social action. How did our national assemblies manage to divide us up into 13,000 clusters, approximately? I don't know what the number is now. Gradually developing cluster agencies, learning to work in 3-month cycles. When you think about it, this is a lot for a world community. I was asked as a member of the teaching center to go down to Liberia at the time that these clusters were being developed. Sometimes teaching center members would go to consult with the counselors and the National Assemblies how to divide up the countries. And I can remember that consultation very well, because I don't know if you remember, there were sort of factors that help you to decide how big a cluster should be. And one of them was transportation. So I was saying, well, so what is the transportation? And they said, well, the Civil War wiped out all the possible public transport. There are no more buses. There are nothing. People's cars were stolen or taken for the army. And so he said, they were saying, this was our transportation, their feet. And so they say, we can walk for one day, then we'll sleep in that village, and then we'll get up and we'll walk for the second day, and that's it. And then that will have to delineate the cluster. So I'm come back to Haifa after my consultation, and one of our members had been to Germany to also discuss with their counselor and their National Assembly how it would be, and that person's reporting about the, what is it called, Nick? The what? The Autobahn, yes, and how they can go 130 kilometers an hour and they can do it, and this will be it. But you see how extraordinary it is when you look at it in world terms. Everybody's obeying the House of Justice, but according to their own cultural circumstances, which are very, very different, of course. So back in 2008 and 9, how many conferences of major nature did we organize? There were 41 of them. Did anybody attend those? Yeah. So suddenly, instead of having one conference in Paris or one conference in Canada, we could organize 41 pretty major conferences around the world. 5 years later, again at the House of Justice's invitation, how many regional youth conferences were we capable of organizing? There was 114 that were organized all around the world. So you begin to get the perspective of the growth that was taking place and how these skills were being developed. What amazed me about those 41 conferences, because I don't know if you remember, but teaching center members had the privilege of going to them. So we each got a list of 8 or 9, and we just sort of went around and went where the House of Justice had asked us to go. And my list was the following: Johannesburg, Oregon in the United States, Texas, the Central African Republic, the Ivory Coast, Mongolia, where it was minus 33 degrees, and the following weekend, Cambodia, where it was plus 33 degrees, and then on to Germany. And we were all just going around. The amazing thing was that there was one set of materials. And that, because of that privilege of having had that experience, one really began to realize that we were one. We were one body in spite of all of these extraordinary differences. It was a very, very inspiring and thrilling time. Honestly, you can go to any airport in the world, and if the Baha'is will meet you and just take you, you'll be familiar with the language, the concept, what they're working on in the middle of the 5-year plan. We don't, I don't think, appreciate the degree to which the extraordinary spiritual power is driving this faith. So I can also ask, how is it that we have over 200 Baha'i councils, regional councils now in the world? We have raised up the last continental temple, but now it seems we're capable of raising 7 at once. The first 2 national and the 5 local. And this is all going to happen, is happening, isn't it, the day after tomorrow that Cambodia is going to be dedicated. The first, Battambang. And so this is an astonishing rate. I think what I draw out of all of this is, oh, well, what will happen in October? How many thousands and tens of thousands of celebrations will there be? Because each of us and even our households are doing them. So there is just no doubt about it that the capacity has been built through these different processes and systems and what the House of Justice has been taking us step by step by step. So I'm trying to make time for my husband, but he told me I could have a little bit of his time. I thought that very generous. So I'm going to try and finish up my stories. It's only through the force of the covenant, right? This is obedience. This is the covenant. This is what is at the base of all of this. The love of the friends throughout the entire world for the House of Justice, the last refuge of a tottering civilization. Now, are we tottering now? I think we're tottering. I think we're tottering, and that we actually feel it. Our neighbors now feel it. Our people around us feel it. Receptivity is reaching a different point now. So the obedience to the House of Justice has been, continues to be, and will always be our strength. So we continue clinging to the covenant. And apparently, humanity, the way I read it, will be brought to its knees. Now, if humanity is going to go to its knees, what do you do when you're on your knees? You beg. You pray. If we're going to reach that degree of difficulties, then thank God for summer schools like this one, when all those children and junior youth and all the youth, and we've got to get prepared. What are we going to give to these young people to give them the formidable strength, reservoirs of strength on which they are going to have to draw as their own lives unfold, and they go through their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, 70s, what will they be asked to do? I wanted to share with you a little bit, just not leave you with Bangui, with the National Assembly members and the difficulties we were having there, and just give you an idea of, in a few different countries, just a couple of stories about what I've heard or learned or know is happening, because these things are not supposed to discourage us because of numbers. Please don't take it that way. They are supposed to make us proud of what the friends in the other areas of the world are finally able to do, given their really rough circumstances. Whenever I would travel into these kind of countries, the French friends would always, well, what are they doing in Paris? That's what they wanted to know. What's happening in Europe? What's happening in Canada? They want to know how this process is. I'm sure it's the same in the English-speaking world, so that we're all together pulling, all together proud of one another, backing one another as we move through all of this. So I think I said the other evening with the music that I had the great honor of being in the Chile choir. So since I was singing in that choir, one of the few foreigners in the choir, I'm on the WhatsApp for the C-O-R-O, for the coro. That means the choir. And so this choir, the 70 people became so enamored of one another after all that singing through, both up at the House of Worship itself, which was, another world type of an experience, and then down at the place where the conference was going on. oh, these people were sending 30, 40, 50 WhatsApp every day. I couldn't possibly keep up with it. But I do read it. You know, I can't speak Spanish either, so I'm slightly disadvantaged, but I sort of make it up as I go along and see a few Baha'i words in there. But one of the most recent ones, just a few days ago, they sent pictures because they had 18,000 visitors in one day. Now that is something, 18,000 visitors. And they sent pictures, I'll show them if you ask me to show on my phone. Long lines of people just standing, waiting. And we met somebody who knew something about it and was able to tell us that, they asked them why, what is it that you want? They said they can't get over the peace. They cannot get over the feeling of beauty and calm that comes to them when they just walk in the gardens or go into the house of worship itself. And you know, during that time in Chile, you probably remember, you read about it, they gave us 10 books each. How many people were in Chile? I hate to repeat, you all know this. Okay, so they gave us 10 little books each, right? And each of us was supposed to find 10 people to give those books to. And so we had 20 between us, so you did, and so did you, and so we did our best. I cheated. I kept one out of just sheer selfishness. And, but I remember giving these to different people, and they kept saying, what? Oh, you mean that thing over there? What is it? You know, and you try to explain. Then you'd say, it's open to all people. Now this was, for me anyway, this was one of the fascinating things. The idea that it wasn't a separation by religion or by class or by educational level, that anybody could go there. Because they have very different divisions of their society. You know, they've been through a great deal in Chile over the last 20, 30 years. So there was one lady at this art center I was visiting, and I gave her this little prayer book, and I said, she looked at it, she said, what is it? I said, it's basically the Word of God. It's prayers, because it was not a pamphlet. We weren't, you know, instructing them about the faith. It was pure Word of God. And she looked at me, she took it in her hand, and she began to cry. She said, I'm desperate for something like this at this point in my life. I'm just talking about personal receptivity of people and how difficult life has become for people all over the planet. So if we offer them a gift like that, that's great. So now back to the Democratic Republic of Congo. I had a very interesting email about a month ago from my close friend Clément. I think I talked about him the other day. And he told me he said they were in the meeting of the Board of Counselors. When those 20 or so counselors of Africa come together, they share all their stories, etc., just the way the counselors do here in Europe. But he said they zeroed in on one village that had 1,446 residents. Clément loves numbers, so he's always being very precise. And he again explained, okay, well, in this small place we have 400 Baha'is, 24 study circles, 34 classes, etc., etc. So they've ended up with 173 core activities with 1,376 participants, so 95% of the population is now engaged in the Baha'i activities. And they're doing their best to keep up with it. They have a local spiritual assembly, they have a chief. The chief is very happy because there are fewer problems, he says, coming to him now, because people are going to the local spiritual assembly. So he's quite happy about that. They've set up their own community school, and they even fixed up or built a road, because before there was no road, no cars could get in. So the Baha'is have undertaken these kinds of projects. He said they have collective agricultural activities, and most recently, a maternity project has been set up. So what I'm just trying to illustrate is how once the tools and the skills and the transformation are in your heart and soul, then even in places like this that are just forlorn, they can move ahead and raise up their people and contribute to the development of their community. He then ended that email by saying, 3 of us are going to go visit that cluster in September, that village, because we want to study it. He said, I'd love to invite you to come along, but there are too many rebels wandering around the region right now, and you wouldn't be safe. So this is the reality of how people are putting their lives on the line as they're moving through these populations. You're aware of Vanuatu, I think, the extraordinary story of their cyclone. Was it a cyclone? Something like that. And how the junior youth, through all their own experience with the junior youth activities, were able to contribute so much to raising up the situation after that cyclone. They also, we heard recently when we were at Greenacre about fishing projects where the fishing had just dropped dead. There were nothing else to do in certain parts around the island, and they were able to instigate a way to leave those parts of the island alone. Nobody was to fish there, so they could regrow. You know, these kinds of things that ended up serving the whole village or area of the island. In India, I'm quite sure you've been following the extraordinary changes of culture there, with the caste system and arranged marriages, the education of the girl child. In New Delhi, I recently had some news from one friend that they are doing huge work in the neighborhoods around the house of worship. Maybe somebody knows more than I do, but the numbers were quite extraordinary. They're beginning to rival with Lubumbashi, you know, that kind of a thing. So they are moving ahead to work with all of the people, and young people especially, in that area. So I'm coming to the end of these remarks. Oh, I better hurry. And I just wanted to say how thankful I am that I've actually managed to be alive and witness this last 40, 50 years that I've been a Baha'i, and seeing how the faith has developed in such a striking manner. To have witnessed the gradual decentralization and spread and establishment in all parts of the globe, and then begun to see this attraction of quite large groups of people from different populations in the 21st century. I wanted to share in closing one of my favorite quotations of Abdu'l-Baha. It's about horses. Maybe you've heard it. And for me, it's because all of us are trying to acquire and develop new capacities and new skills quite so rapidly. Abdu'l-Baha is very encouraging. Here's what he says. In Persia, there is a wonderful breed of horses which are trained to run long distances at very great speed. They are most carefully trained at first. They are taken out into the fields. They're made to run a short course. And at the commencement of their training, they're not able to run far. The distance is gradually increased. They become thinner and thinner, wiry and lean, but their strength increases. Finally, after months of rigid training, their swiftness and endurance become wonderful. They are able to run at full speed across rough country, many parasangs of distance. At first, this would have been impossible. Not until they become trained, thin and wiry, can they endure this severe test. In this way, I shall train you. Come, 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 little by little, until your powers of endurance become so increased that you will serve the cause of God continually, without other motive, without other thought or wish. This is my desire. So as each of us only has one life on this earthly plane, may we serve the Blessed Beauty and the Universal House of Justice to the absolute best of our ability, especially at this critical time when opportunities to spread His faith are so great. Thank you.